had always liked the quiet. I think that's why I enjoyed camping alone. Something about being out in the open, away from people, away from noise, just me and the world. It was something I did at least once every few months, and over the years I had gotten pretty good at it. I knew how to pack right, how to ration food, how to deal with the little problems that came up. This time, I had picked a spot in Montana, not too far from the Bitterroot National Forest. It wasn't one of those established campgrounds with picnic tables and bathrooms. It was just a patch of wilderness I had scouted on an old map, deep enough in that I wouldn't see anyone, but not so far that I'd be in serious trouble if something went wrong. The drive out there was long. The last stretch was nothing but dirt roads, winding through thick trees. Every so often, I'd pass an old cabin, some abandoned, some probably still in use, judging by the way the grass had been cut down around them. But there weren't many. The further I got, the fewer signs of people I saw. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked off the road, shouldered my pack, and hiked in about 4 miles before I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a creek, shielded by tall pines. It was mid-September, so the weather was still good, warm during the day, a little chilly at night. The kind of weather that makes you sleep deep, wrapped up in a sleeping bag. Setting up camp was second nature. I got the tent up, laid out my gear, started a small fire. I made some coffee, sat back against a log, and just listened. The wind through the trees, the distant rush of the creek. No cars, no voices, just quiet. That first day was uneventful. I spent most of it walking the area, just getting familiar with the land. I had my .45 pistol on me, always did when I camped alone. Not because I was scared, but because you never know. The worst thing in the woods is always another person. I didn't see anyone, though. Just deer, squirrels, the occasional hawk circling high overhead. By the time the sun started to set, I had a good fire going again. I ate, read for a bit with my flashlight, then turned in early. I slept hard. I woke up just before dawn, not sure why. The fire was mostly dead, just glowing embers. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and that's when I noticed it. Something had been near my tent. I always cleared the ground before I set up, making sure there weren't any sharp sticks or rocks. But now, just a few feet from where I slept, I saw disturbed dirt. It looked like a footprint. Not a boot, not a shoe, but something that had pressed down hard enough to leave a shape. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it on the ground. The print wasn't clear, but it was big. It didn't have the shape of a bear's paw. It looked human, barefoot, but the toes were off. I crouched down, trying to make sense of it. It almost looked like a person's footprint, but the front was too long. The toes stretched out in a way that didn't seem right. And there was something else. It was facing my tent. I swallowed, standing up, scanning the dark trees around me. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Just the wind through the leaves. I didn't like it. I checked my gun, made sure it was loaded. Then I stoked the fire, got it burning again. I didn't go back to sleep. I just sat there, staring into the woods, waiting for the sun to come up. By daylight, the print looked less clear, but I knew what I had seen. I thought about leaving, packing up, heading back to my truck. But I told myself it was nothing. Probably just an animal, maybe the shape of the dirt had made it look like something it wasn't. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent that whole day on edge. I didn't go far from camp, didn't want to be too far from my gear. Every sound seemed sharper. Every little movement in the trees made my pulse jump. Then I found the second footprint. About 50 yards from camp, near a fallen tree. This one was clearer. It had the same stretched out toes, the same shape. It was deep, pressed hard into the soft ground, like whoever or whatever had made it was heavy. And this one was facing away from my camp. Like whoever had been watching me had walked away. That was enough for me. I wasn't about to stay another night out there. I had hiked miles into the woods, but I could make it back before dark if I moved fast. I hurried back to camp, started packing up. Then I heard it. A snap. Not far. A branch breaking. I froze, listening. The woods were still again. Then another snap. Closer. I pulled my gun, scanning the trees. My breathing was too loud. My heartbeat was in my ears. Then I saw it. Something moved between the trees. I only caught a glimpse, a shape tall just at the edge of my vision. Not running, not moving fast, just standing there, watching me. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started moving, fast. I wasn't running, but I was close. My hands stayed on my gun. As I walked, I kept hearing it. Footsteps, not behind me, not close, but following. Always just out of sight. The hike back felt 10 times longer than it had on the way in. I didn't stop, didn't take breaks. I just walked, heart hammering, eyes scanning every shadow. The whole time I felt watched. I reached the truck just as the sun was setting. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Then, just before I started the engine, I saw it. A figure, standing at the tree line, tall, too tall, and it was barefoot. I didn't stay to get a better look. I turned the key, gunned the engine, and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement. Didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. The rain had started in the early evening, slow at first, just a light drizzle tapping against the leaves. I barely noticed it when I was setting up my tent. The air smelled of damp earth, thick with the scent of pine, and the forest was quiet apart from the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. It was supposed to be a peaceful solo trip, a break from everything. No people, no noise, just me, my gear, and the deep woods of France. I had driven out from Lyon earlier that day, heading towards a remote camping spot near an old logging road. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a clearing I had found on a map. No trails leading in, no signs of people, just the dense tree line stretching endlessly in every direction. The kind of place where you wouldn't run into anyone unless they were looking for it. By the time my tent was up and my small fire was going, the rain had started to pick up. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, watching the flames flicker and struggle against the wind. I wasn't worried. I had checked the forecast before coming out here, and while it warned of rain, there was nothing severe expected. Just a storm passing through. I had chosen my spot carefully, slightly elevated, away from any areas that could flood. The trees around me were thick, towering high, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. Felt secluded, safe. The kind of place where the rest of the world didn't exist. I ate quickly, a simple meal cooked over my small stove, and settled into my tent just as the rain became heavier. The soft pattering on the fabric was comforting at first. I had always liked the sound of rain, the way it made the world feel smaller, more enclosed, safe. But sometime during the night, that feeling changed. It wasn't sudden. There was no loud noise, no obvious sign that something was wrong. It was just a shift, a slow creeping awareness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up, but the rain was still falling steadily. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan, their branches scraping against one another. I lay still, listening, trying to figure out what had woken me. First, I thought it was nothing, just the storm, but then I heard it. Something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was something else. Something slow, deliberate. I held my breath, heart pounding against my ribs. It was faint, barely noticeable over the sound of the rain, but it was there. Footsteps, not heavy, not rushed, just soft, careful movements outside my tent. I stayed completely still, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A deer? Maybe? But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. I reached slowly for my flashlight, gripping it tightly, my fingers cold and stiff. I didn't turn it on. Not yet. Instead, I listened. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, just the rain and the wind. But I knew something was out there. I could feel it. The way the air seemed different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. Then the sound of wet fabric, a shuffle, a slight movement, the unmistakable sound of someone shifting their weight in damp clothes. I felt my chest tighten. Someone was standing outside my tent. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any more sounds. Breathing, movement, nothing, just silence. But they were there. I knew they were. I lay there for what felt like hours, gripping my flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. If they didn't know I was awake, maybe they'd leave. Maybe they'd think I hadn't heard them. Then suddenly the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I felt my stomach drop. They were moving. Not away, not toward me, just around. Slowly, testing, waiting. The sound stopped directly behind me, just inches from where my head rested against the thin fabric of the tent. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing now, shallow and slow. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, in one quick movement, something pressed against the side of my tent. Not a hand, not a foot, something sharp. A blade? A stick? It traced along the fabric slowly, deliberately, as if testing the material. I gritted my teeth, my grip tightening on the flashlight. My mind was screaming at me to do something, to run, to fight. But I was frozen. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure was gone. The footsteps moved away, slow at first, then faster, fading into the rain. I waited, listening, barely daring to breathe. The forest was silent again, apart from the storm. I didn't move, not for a long time. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn started to break through the trees, my body stiff, my muscles aching from staying so still. When I finally worked up the nerve to unzip my tent, my hands were shaking. The forest was empty, no sign of anyone, no footprints in the mud, no broken branches, nothing to prove that anyone had been there at all. But when I turned to check the back of my tent, my breath caught in my throat. There, cut into the fabric, was a single deep slash. Not an accident, not an animal, a deliberate mark, a reminder. I packed up my gear in record time, stuffing everything into my bag without caring if it was wet. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just left, hiking fast and hard until I reached my car. As I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, I tried to make sense of it. Who had been out there? Why had they just stood there watching me? And what would have happened if I had made a noise? I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. And to this day, whenever I hear rain tapping against my window at night, I think of that slow, deliberate sound of footsteps circling my tent. And I wonder if somewhere out there, they're still waiting. We had been briefed 2 days before deployment. The intelligence team had gathered enough evidence of a large-scale smuggling operation happening deep in the forests near the border. Guns, drugs, maybe even human trafficking. We didn't have all the details yet. What we did know was that these guys were organized, well-armed, and had been operating undisturbed for years. Our job was to change that. The terrain was going to be rough. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, thick with pine and undergrowth that made movement slow and visibility difficult. It was the kind of place where a group could disappear without a trace if they knew the land well enough. That was our biggest concern. These people had been here for years, and we were stepping into their backyard. We were dropped off miles away from our target area. No vehicles, no heavy machinery, just boots, rifles, and whatever we could carry on our backs. The plan was simple. Move in quietly, locate the camp, confirm the intel, and then either capture or neutralize the targets. Simple in theory, but nothing about this mission felt easy. The first night, we moved through the trees in silence. The wind howled through the branches, and every step on the damp forest floor sounded louder than it should have. We had night vision, but it wasn't perfect. The shadows played tricks on the eyes, and every shifting branch made you wonder if someone was watching. We camped in shifts, 2 men awake at all times, scanning the trees for movement. The temperature dropped sharply after midnight, and the cold bit through the layers of our uniforms. No fires, no talking, just waiting. By the next day, we had closed in on the target area. Tracks in the dirt confirmed that people had been moving through here recently, more than just a few. We found cigarette butts, old food cans, even the remains of a small fire. They were nearby. That evening, we got our first look at the camp. Through the scope, I could see at least a dozen men, maybe more. The camp was bigger than we expected. Multiple tents, a few makeshift wooden structures, and stacks of crates covered with tarps. Smuggling for sure. They had guards posted at every entrance, armed, alert, moving in and out of a small shack, probably storing weapons or money. We had two options: call for backup and wait, or move in immediately and take our chances. We chose the second. The attack was supposed to be fast. Get in, take them out before they even realized what was happening. It didn't go that way. As soon as the first shot was fired, the whole place erupted into chaos. The smugglers weren't just some ragtag group of criminals, they were trained. Their response was immediate. We lost a man in the first few seconds. A round hit him just as he was moving forward, and he dropped before anyone could react. No screams, no sound, just down. The gunfight lasted longer than it should have. The trees became a war zone, bullets ripping through bark and branches, kicking up dirt and smoke. Every step forward felt like walking into a trap. They had the high ground in some places, and they used it. I dropped behind a fallen tree, catching my breath while my heart pounded in my ears. A few feet away, one of our guys was reloading, his hands steady despite the chaos. We had trained for this. I moved up, scanning through the green haze of my night vision. A shadow shifted near one of the tents. I fired. The figure dropped, but another one appeared right behind him, gun raised. I barely had time to react before a shot rang out from my left. One of my team had taken him down. The fight dragged on longer than expected. The smugglers had tunnels, hidden paths through the trees, and they used every advantage they had. We had numbers and training, but they had the land. By the time we cleared the camp, 3 of our men were dead. A few others wounded, but still moving. The bodies of the smugglers lay scattered around the camp, some half hidden by the undergrowth. The crates, once neatly stacked, had been ripped open in the chaos. Weapons, drugs, everything the intel had warned us about. The operation was a success, but it didn't feel like one. We secured the area, called in for extraction, and waited. The silence felt unnatural after the gunfire. The smell of blood and gunpowder mixed with the damp earth. I looked at the bodies of the men we had lost. They had been there just hours ago, breathing, talking, moving with us. Now they were gone. Just names to be reported, dog tags to be sent home. By the time the helicopters arrived, the forest had gone quiet again, as if nothing had happened, as if the trees would just swallow the camp back into the earth, erasing all signs of what had happened here. We left as the sun rose, the first light cutting through the trees, washing everything in gold. The mission was over. The smugglers were gone. But I knew I'd never forget that night, that place, or the feeling of walking through a forest where men had died and knowing it would always be there, waiting in the silence. I went to the Amazon rainforest in 2018 with a plan to spend 2 weeks camping alone. I had experience with solo camping, but nothing like this. The jungle was an entirely different world, dense, loud, and alive in a way that no other place was. I had flown into Manaus and hired a guide to take me upriver. He dropped me off near a tributary of the Rio Negro, deep in the jungle. I had my gear, tent, machete, plenty of food, a satellite phone for emergencies. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. The first few days went smoothly. The jungle was overwhelming at times, the heat suffocating, the humidity unbearable, but I managed. Every night, I listened to the endless calls of insects, birds, and animals in the distance. Sometimes I heard rustling nearby, but I told myself it was just the wildlife. On the 4th night, things started to feel different. The noises of the jungle seemed off. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. The sounds were still there, but there was a pattern to them, almost like something or someone was moving deliberately through the trees. I tried to brush it off. I had read that paranoia was common when camping alone in remote places. But as the night stretched on, the feeling got worse. I kept my machete close, barely sleeping. The next morning, I decided to move my camp. I had been near a small stream, which was convenient for water, but I didn't like how open the area felt. I hiked deeper into the jungle, setting up in a more concealed spot between thick trees. That night, the unease returned. I woke up to something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, too heavy for an animal, too steady. I held my breath, gripping my machete. The sound circled my tent, stopping just outside. Then silence. I waited, my heart pounding, but nothing happened. After what felt like forever, I heard the steps retreating. I didn't move until the sun started to rise. When I finally stepped out of my tent, the first thing I noticed was the footprints in the dirt. Bare human footprints. I had seen no signs of people since being dropped off. I was supposed to be alone. I packed up immediately, deciding to head back toward the river. The jungle was thick, making it hard to move quickly, but I pushed through, sweating, my heart racing. As I hiked, I kept checking behind me. I had the feeling I was being watched. By late afternoon, I reached the riverbank, but I wasn't sure what to do. I could wait for my guide to return, but that wouldn't be for another 10 days. I had my satellite phone, but I hesitated to call for help. I didn't even know how to explain what was happening. That night, I set up my tent close to the water, hoping the open space would make it harder for anything to sneak up on me. I built a fire, something I hadn't been doing before, thinking it might keep whatever was out there away. I barely slept. At some point during the night, I heard splashing in the river. It wasn't the usual noise of fish or caimans moving in the water. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was wading through. Then I heard the footsteps again. They stopped just outside the glow of my fire. I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering light, but I knew something, or someone, was there, watching. I didn't move. Eventually, the steps retreated again. The splashing faded. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time, they were closer. I couldn't stay any longer. I used my satellite phone, calling for an emergency pickup. It would take hours for someone to reach me, but I had no other choice. I spent the entire day on edge, machete in hand, listening, waiting. By late afternoon, I heard the sound of a boat approaching. Relief washed over me. As I gathered my things, I glanced back at the tree line one last time. That's when I saw him, a man, barely visible between the trees, watching me. I couldn't make out his face, but I knew he had been following me. I turned and ran to the boat. I didn't look back. As we sped away down the river, I felt the weight of the jungle pressing in behind me. I would never know who that man was or what he wanted, and I never wanted to find out. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me, the trees, and a weekend of quiet. I had taken trips like this before, always finding peace in being alone with nothing but a tent and the sounds of the forest. This time, I had picked a remote area deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from any designated campsites or trails. A place where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That's what I wanted, what I always wanted. I had driven for hours, first on paved roads, then on dirt ones, until I reached the end of a barely visible track that led into the trees. The forest was thick, the kind that swallowed up sound and sunlight. By the time I found a good spot near a small clearing, the sun was already getting low. I parked my truck off to the side, making sure it wasn't too visible from the road. Not that anyone would be coming this far. Setting up camp was routine. Tent up, sleeping bag rolled out, small fire pit prepared. I had enough supplies to last 3 days. Food, water, a knife, and my old .357 revolver. Something I always carried when camping alone, more for peace of mind than anything else. There were bears out here and mountain lions too. By the time the fire was going and my first meal was cooked, the forest had settled into an eerie silence. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just stillness. That wasn't unusual, though. Sometimes the woods just felt like that. I ignored it and ate my food, watching the flames flicker against the darkening sky. I had planned to stay up for a while, maybe read a little by flashlight, but something about the quiet was getting to me. Instead, I killed the fire early, made sure everything was secured, and crawled into my tent. The sound of the zipper closing felt loud in the silence. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the fabric of the tent, listening. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up to a noise. A single snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. My eyes opened instantly. I stayed completely still, ears straining in the darkness. Nothing. Then another snap, closer this time. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch or some small animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was deliberate, slow, like someone trying to move carefully but stepping on something they didn't see. I reached for the revolver, gripping it tightly, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. My truck was parked about 20 yards away, hidden by trees. The fire pit was cold, the tent dark. If someone was out there, they wouldn't know for sure if I was awake. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting. Then I heard it, a low, slow exhale just outside the tent. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone was standing right there. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My fingers tightened around the grip of my gun. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my head. The presence outside stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, finally, slow footsteps moved away. Not into the woods, not toward the road. They went toward my truck. I forced myself to breathe, to move. Carefully, silently, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The night was dark, the trees casting long shadows, but I could just make out the shape of someone near my truck. They weren't trying to break in. They were just standing there, watching it, or maybe waiting. A sick feeling settled in my gut. I had locked the truck, kept the keys in my tent, but this wasn't some lost hiker looking for help. Whoever this was had found my camp, stood outside my tent, and now was lingering by my only way out of here. I had two choices: stay put and hope they left, or make a move before things got worse. I chose the second. Slowly, I unzipped the tent further, keeping my body low, making as little noise as possible. The person hadn't moved. I could see them clearer now. A man, tall, wearing dark clothing. No backpack, no gear. Just standing there, staring at my truck. I moved like I was stepping through a minefield, creeping toward the edge of the trees. If I could get around him, get to the truck fast enough, I could be out of here in seconds. Then, just as I reached the tree line, the man's head snapped toward me. I ran. I heard him move at the same time, sprinting after me. My boots pounded against the dirt as I closed the distance to my truck, my breath ragged. I could hear him fast closing in. I yanked the door open, barely getting in before I heard him slam into the side of the truck. The whole vehicle shook. I jammed the keys in the ignition. The engine roared to life. The man was at my window, hands pressed against the glass, face inches from mine. But I didn't look. I didn't think. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt. Then I was flying down the dirt road, branches whipping against the sides. I didn't look back. Not until I was miles away, heart still hammering. When I finally reached a gas station on the highway, I pulled in, parked, and just sat there, hands gripping the wheel. My whole body was shaking. I didn't go back for my tent. I didn't even care about the gear I left behind. All I could think about was one thing. There was no other car, no other campsite. That man had walked all the way into the middle of nowhere. No supplies, no light. He had been waiting for someone like me to come along. And if I had stayed in that tent just a little longer, I don't think I would have made it out. I had always liked the idea of being alone in nature, away from the sounds of cars, away from people, away from everything. I had camped plenty of times before, sometimes with friends, sometimes with my wife, but this time I wanted to do it alone. It was late October, a bad time for most people to camp, but to me that made it even better. The cold kept people away. I chose a remote forest in northern Montana, a place that was rarely visited, with no campsites or marked trails, just wild land. I had done some research and found an area that seemed perfect. A large clearing beside a small river, surrounded by thick trees. I packed everything I needed, enough food for a few days, extra clothes, a reliable knife, a fire starter, and my rifle just in case. The weather was supposed to be cold but clear. It took nearly 5 hours to hike to the spot. The first couple of hours were on a rough dirt path, but then I had to go off-trail, making my way through dense trees and uneven ground. I followed my GPS, making sure I stayed on course. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I reached the clearing in the late afternoon. It was just as I had imagined, peaceful, undisturbed. The river was about 20 yards away, moving slow and steady. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, where the trees could block some of the wind. I gathered wood for a fire and sat by it as the sky darkened. The cold was creeping in fast. I had layers on, but I could still feel it biting at my face and hands. I cooked a quick meal, ate, and stared into the flames. That first night was quiet. I heard owls calling in the distance, the wind moving through the trees. I had expected it to feel peaceful, but something about the silence unsettled me. I tried to push the feeling away and focused on the warmth of the fire. When I finally crawled into my tent, I fell asleep fast, exhausted from the long hike. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, freezing. The fire had gone out. I checked my watch, 3:12 a.m. The tent was shaking slightly from the wind, but I could hear something else. A sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, something moving through the trees. A slow, steady rustling, like footsteps. It didn't sound like an animal. I held my breath and listened. Then silence. I stayed still for a long time, waiting. The wind picked up, making it harder to hear anything. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just the wind moving branches, maybe a deer passing through. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around my camp. Everything seemed normal, but something felt off. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, but there was a small patch of disturbed earth near the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me uneasy. Still, I pushed it aside. I was in the middle of the woods, of course there would be noises. I spent the day fishing at the river, hiking a little, trying to enjoy the trip. By the time evening came, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined it. But that night, it happened again. It was later this time, past 4 a.m. I was asleep when something snapped me awake. Another sound, closer. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to listen past the wind. Came again. Soft, slow footsteps, right outside my tent. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then, something brushed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just a light drag of something across the fabric. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A branch moving in the wind? But deep down, I knew. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I thought about calling out, but I didn't want to give away that I was awake. And then, just as suddenly as it came, the sound was gone. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Nothing. When the sky started to lighten, I finally unzipped the tent. There were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They circled my tent, moving slowly, deliberately. The prints led back into the trees. I stood there, staring, my breath visible in the cold air. I had never felt fear like that before. Someone had been out here, watching me, walking around my tent in the middle of the night. I packed up immediately. I wasn't staying another night. The hike back felt different. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every movement in the trees made me glance over my shoulder. Took me hours to get back to my truck. When I finally saw it, I almost ran. I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I turned the key, started the engine, and sped off down the dirt road, not looking back. I never went camping alone again. Whoever was out there, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing through. They knew exactly where I was, and they had been watching. Camping with my sir was supposed to be a break from everything: work, city noise, and daily routines. We had done it before, but this time we chose a more secluded spot, a place deeper in the woods, far from any campsite or park rangers. It was his idea. He liked the silence, the rawness of the wilderness, and the way the world disappeared when we were surrounded by trees. It was late autumn, the kind of weather where the cold creeps in before the sun even sets. We had driven for hours, past small towns and fading gas stations, before turning onto a dirt road that led into the forest. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, dark and still, barely moving in the light breeze. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the trees bare, their twisted limbs reaching out like old bones. We found a clearing just big enough for our tent and a small fire pit. It was near a stream, the water running low but steady. The sound was soft, almost comforting. We unpacked, set up camp, and gathered wood before it got too dark. The sun had already dipped behind the treetops, leaving only a sliver of orange on the horizon. By the time the fire was going, the temperature had dropped. We sat close, eating our packed meals, listening to the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Probably just animals moving around, but in a place like this, every sound felt sharper. The first few hours were peaceful. The quiet was nice, in a way that made you forget about everything else. But as the night settled in, that quiet started to feel heavier. The kind that makes you aware of how alone you really are. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no lights, just the fire flickering, casting shadows across the trees. I kept glancing past the fire, into the darkness beyond. The trees stood still, but the space between them felt off, as if something was just out of sight, just beyond where the firelight reached. It was just my mind playing tricks. It had to be. The night stretched on. The fire burned low, and the cold pressed in. Sir was already lying in the tent, half asleep. I stayed up a little longer, watching the embers glow, listening to the faint rustle of leaves. Then there was a sound, a snap, close, not the kind from a small animal. This was something stepping on a branch, breaking it underfoot. Heavy, deliberate. I froze. My body tensed, eyes locked on the darkness. The sound came again, from behind the trees. Slow, steady steps. Not rushing, not hesitant. Just moving. I turned toward the tent, ready to wake Sir, but then it stopped. Nothing, just silence. My breath was slow, controlled, ears straining. The fire flickered, its glow reaching only a few feet beyond the clearing. Whatever it was just beyond that line. Watching, I sat there for what felt like hours, not moving, barely breathing. But nothing else happened. No more sounds, no movement. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. The mind does weird things in the dark. I threw a few more logs onto the fire before slipping into the tent. Sir was already fast asleep, his slow breathing the only sound inside. I zipped up the entrance, trying to ignore how exposed the tent felt, how thin the material was between us and whatever was out there. Sleep didn't come easy. Every small noise outside had me on edge. The wind moved through the trees, and I told myself that's all it was, just the wind. Then I heard it again. Closer this time, right outside the tent. A footstep, heavy, careful. I held my breath, eyes wide in the darkness. My hand moved slowly toward the camping knife near my sleeping bag. I gripped the handle tight. The fire outside was still burning, but the light inside the tent was dim. Shadows shifted as the flames flickered. Then another step, right next to the tent. The fabric moved slightly. Something was out there. I felt Sir stir beside me, shifting slightly in his sleep, unaware of what was happening. My heart pounded, every muscle locked in place. Then the sound stopped again. just silence. I stayed awake for hours, gripping that knife, listening, waiting, but nothing else came. No more footsteps, no movement. Eventually, exhaustion won. My body gave in and I slipped into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was early morning. The fire had burned down to ash, and the cold had settled in deep. The first thing I did was check outside. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, disturbed only by our own footprints from the night before. I scanned the clearing, then moved toward the edge of the trees. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Large, deep prints in the dirt. Not from a bear. Not from any animal. These were human, but they weren't ours. They circled the campsite. Slow, measured steps, walking just along the edge of the fire's glow. I followed them a little further into the trees. The tracks went on for several yards, stopping at a large tree. Then nothing. No return tracks. No signs of someone leaving. Just gone. A chill ran through me, deeper than the morning cold. Sir woke up a little while later, stretching, yawning, completely unaware of what had happened. I didn't tell him at first. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But as we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we drove back onto the dirt road, leaving the woods behind, I finally told him. He didn't say much, just nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Neither of us spoke for a while, but as we merged onto the highway, putting miles between us and that place, I caught him glancing at the rearview mirror, checking, watching. I didn't ask what he was looking for, because I was doing the same thing.